Before we start, please make sure to like, subscribe, and share this video with your friends and family. Also, can you please tell me from where and what time you're watching? Thanks.
The air was crisp and biting as I made my annual pilgrimage up to the rugged wilderness of Vermont. Hunting season was a tradition I refused to miss, though I couldn't justify owning property just for these trips. Renting a cabin for the weekend always seemed like the smarter option. This year, I'd booked a small, secluded place near the edge of a national forest. It was my chance to escape the chaos of city life and reconnect with the solitude of nature. I'd been going alone since my uncle's health declined a few years back. He was the one who first taught me how to hunt. But now it was just me, my gear, and the vast silent woods. Last November I'd chosen a place so far off the beaten path that I wondered if anyone else had even set foot there. By the time I reached the cabin on Friday night, the moon hung low in a starless sky, and the air was unnervingly still. The dirt road leading to the cabin was narrow and winding, flanked by skeletal trees whose bare branches seemed to reach out, clawing at the darkness. My headlights barely pierced the gloom as I pulled up to the tiny wooden cabin. The owner had texted me earlier, saying the key was under the mat. Sure enough, there it was. Inside, the cabin was cozy, if not a little too quiet. The warmth of the preset heater was a welcome contrast to the chill outside. I unpacked my bags, setting my hunting gear neatly in the corner of the bedroom, and collapsed onto the bed. The next morning, the alarm jolted me awake just as the first light of dawn crept over the horizon. I grabbed my rifle, layered up against the cold, and stepped out into the crisp air. The forest was eerily still, the silence broken only by the crunch of frost under my boots. After walking for a while, I found a spot behind a fallen tree and settled in, scanning the quiet woods. It wasn't long before a voice startled me. "What do you think you're doing here?" I spun around, heart racing. A man stood behind me, his gray hair wild and unkempt, his face etched with irritation. He looked about 50, though his weathered skin suggested he'd spent years battling the elements. "Hunting's restricted here," he growled, his voice low and gravelly. I didn't know," I stammered, fumbling for an explanation. He scowled, pointing a finger at me. "I've seen plenty like you, city folk who don't belong in these woods. You'd better head back the way you came." His words sent a chill through me, but it was the way he said them, like he'd been watching me long before I arrived, that made my skin crawl. I nodded, muttered an apology, and quickly packed up my gear, retreating toward the cabin. By the time I returned, the encounter still lingered in my mind, but I brushed it off as just an unpleasant run-in. Yet, when I reached the cabin, the front door was slightly ajar. I froze. Had I forgotten to lock it? Or had someone been here? Stepping inside cautiously, I scanned the room. Nothing seemed missing, but the placement of a few items felt off. My hunting pack was unzipped, though I always kept it closed. Maybe I was just imagining things. Shaking it off, I decided to grab some takeout from a nearby village. Later that evening, back at the cabin, I ate my food while watching an old black and white movie. I tried to relax, but something felt wrong, like a shadow lurking at the edge of my thoughts. By the time I crawled into bed, exhaustion finally began to pull me under. I was drifting between wakefulness and sleep, when a faint metallic click snapped me back to full awareness. The closet door was open. I stared at it, heart pounding. It had been shut when I went to bed. I was sure of it. Slowly, I reached for the pistol in my bag, the weight of it both comforting and terrifying in my hand. "Come out," I called, my voice shaking. "I'm armed." For a moment there was silence. Then the door creaked open further. The man from the woods stepped out, a twisted grin spreading across his face. "You got me," he said, his voice dripping with mockery. I pointed the gun at him, struggling to steady my aim. "Don't move, I'm calling the cops." He didn't flinch, didn't argue. Instead, he just stood there, smiling that unnerving smile. As I dialed 911, he began to mutter about people like me, outsiders who didn't belong. His words were incoherent at times, but the venom in his tone was unmistakable. Wait for the sheriff felt like an eternity. I kept the gun trained on him, my finger hovering over the trigger. When the deputies finally arrived, they cuffed him without incident. Later, the Airbnb host claimed he had no idea who the man was. He seemed more concerned about his property than my safety. The sheriff suggested the man might have been squatting in the area, using the cabin's isolation to his advantage. To this day, I can't shake the feeling that he'd been watching me long before our encounter in the woods. I never went back to that cabin, or anywhere near those woods again. The first time I ever went hunting alone, I was 15 years old. It was mid-November, and the air carried the kind of chill that made you feel alive, sharp, and alert. My family had been hunting for generations, and this year I was finally trusted to go out solo. My dad and I had planned everything meticulously. His hunting spot was about 7 miles northeast of mine, and we'd agreed to meet back at camp before dark. It felt like a rite of passage, a chance to prove I could handle myself. The hunting ground was deep in the wooded hills of Vermont, a quiet and isolated patch of forest that we'd hunted for years. I had my gear, a scoped .308 rifle, a small pack with snacks, a thermos of hot coffee, and a flashlight strapped to my belt. My hunting blind was a sturdy little setup about 2 miles from the road. I liked it because it was surrounded by tall pines that muffled the wind, making it easy to hear every rustle and snap of the woods around me. The day had gone by uneventfully. I hadn't seen anything worth taking a shot at, and by 4:30 p.m., the temperature was dropping fast. The sinking sun painted the horizon in hues of deep orange and purple, but it also signaled that I should pack up and head back. I zipped up my pack, slung my rifle over my shoulder, and made sure I left the blind neat and tidy. As I stepped outside, something caught my eye. A trail of flattened leaves leading away from the blind. It wasn't there when I arrived. The path was too wide for a deer and too fresh for me to ignore. A sudden uneasiness crept up my spine, but I told myself it was probably just a black bear passing through. Still, I decided to keep my pace brisk as I started the trek back toward camp. The forest seemed to change as the light faded. Shadows stretched longer, and the once friendly woods now felt watchful. About a mile into my walk, I heard it, a sound that froze me mid-step. It was a guttural, choking howl, something between an animal's roar and a person's scream. It was faint at first, maybe 200 yards back, but unmistakably there. My heart thudded in my chest as I strained my ears. Whatever it was, it didn't sound natural. I tightened my grip on my rifle and pressed on, my boots crunching against the frost-covered leaves. My mind raced with possibilities. Could it be a wounded animal? Or something more dangerous? The sound came again, closer this time and louder. It was primal and raw, the kind of noise that makes you feel like prey. Panic set in. I started running, awkwardly at first with my heavy gear, but adrenaline kicked in fast. The forest whipped past me in blurs of black and gray as I tried to focus on the narrow trail ahead. The creature howled again, and this time it was so close I could almost feel the vibration of it in my chest. I dared a glance back, and my breath caught in my throat. In the pale moonlight I saw it, a towering, gangly silhouette moving through the trees. It had to be at least 10 feet tall, with limbs that seemed too long for its thin frame. It wasn't running, just striding purposefully, closing the distance between us with terrifying ease. I couldn't make out its face, but its presence alone was enough to paralyze me with fear. Somehow, I forced my legs to move, pushing harder than I ever had in my life. The trail ended abruptly at Rabbit Ridge Road, a gravel path that I recognized as the main route back to camp. My boots skidded on the loose stones as I turned and sprinted down the road. I could barely think. My only focus was on putting as much distance between me and that thing as possible. By the time I reached camp, I was drenched in sweat despite the freezing air. My chest burned, and my legs felt like jelly. I stumbled onto the porch of the cabin, dropped my rifle, and collapsed to my knees. The bile rose in my throat, and I vomited until there was nothing left. When I finally looked back toward the woods, it was there, standing at the edge of the trees. It hadn't followed me all the way, but it lingered, watching. I don't remember much after that. My dad found me an hour later, pale and shaking, barely coherent as I tried to explain what had happened. He didn't believe me at first, chalked it up to my imagination or exhaustion. But the look in my eyes must have convinced him I wasn't lying. I didn't sleep that night. Every creak of the cabin or rustle of the wind outside felt like a prelude to that thing returning. For weeks afterward, I stayed away from the woods, too terrified to even think about hunting. Eventually, life went on, but I've never gone back to that part of the forest. Whatever I saw out there, it wasn't something meant to be seen, and even now, all these years later, the memory of those howls still sends chills down my spine. evening air buzzed with excitement as I tossed my school bag onto the couch and hurried to pack my things. I was 13, and it was the opening weekend of hunting season. This wasn't just any hunting trip. It was to our family's favorite spot in Pine Hollow, a sprawling 300-acre reserve nestled deep in the heart of Louisiana. My dad, my grandpa, and I had been planning this trip for weeks. It was our tradition, a ritual that connected generations. We left just after dinner, driving through the winding back roads in silence. Except for the occasional banter between Dad and Grandpa, by the time we arrived, the sky had turned inky black. The campsite was simple, a weathered cabin surrounded by dense forest, with a fire pit that crackled welcomingly. The cabin was too old and creaky for comfort, so we usually pitched tents nearby, especially after Grandpa once found a massive snakeskin tucked under a cot. The night air was cool, and the stars stretched endlessly above us. We gathered around the fire, swapping stories and sharing laughs. Then, it happened. A scream ripped through the stillness, slicing through our laughter like a knife. It wasn't an animal or a human. It was something in between, something unnatural. Everyone froze. The sound came from the direction of the woods, somewhere just beyond the faint glow of the firelight. What the hell was that? Grandpa's voice, usually so steady, wavered. The ranch owner, a wiry old man named Jeb, was the first to act. "Might be a cougar," he muttered, though his face betrayed his doubt. He handed a flashlight to Dad and gestured for him to check it out. I wanted to join them, partly out of curiosity, and partly because I couldn't bear the thought of sitting alone with that sound still ringing in my ears. But Grandpa's firm hand on my shoulder kept me by the fire. Dad and Jeb returned after a tense 20 minutes. They hadn't found anything. No tracks, no signs of movement, but the unease hung heavy in the air. Sleep didn't come easy that night. I lay in the tent, clutching my rifle and staring at the canvas ceiling as the wind howled outside. Morning came all too soon, with Grandpa nudging me awake before dawn. "Time to head out," he said gruffly, his voice a poor match for the tender way he tucked an extra flashlight into my bag. He drove me out to my blind on the ATV, dropping me off with a nod and a warning, "Stay alert." The blind was a simple wooden structure perched in a tree, overlooking a narrow trail that cut through the woods. As the ATV's engine faded into the distance, I climbed the ladder, the rungs cold under my hands. The forest was eerily silent, save for the occasional rustle of leaves in the wind. I settled in, cradling my .22 rifle, and waited for the first light of dawn. The minutes dragged by, and the darkness felt heavier than usual, pressing down on me. I almost didn't notice the figure on the trail at first. My mind dismissed it as a shadow or a trick of the dim light, but as it moved, slowly and deliberately, my heart sank. Reaching for the night vision scope Grandpa had given me, I peered through the lens. I expected to see a deer or maybe a wild hog. Instead, I saw something I couldn't comprehend. It had the outline of a person but was too distorted, its movements too jerky. Its limbs seemed unnaturally long, its silhouette wavering like heat rising off asphalt. Then it stopped and turned its head toward me. It saw me. I froze, unable to look away as the figure stared back. Even through the grainy green of the night vision, I could feel its gaze, piercing and cold. And then it screamed. The same sound from the night before, only this time it was louder, closer. My body locked up, fear anchoring me in place. I couldn't breathe, couldn't think, until my hands moved on their own, raising the rifle. I fired once, then again, emptying the clip into the trail. The sharp cracks of gunfire shattered the quiet, but the figure didn't fall. I fumbled for my second rifle, a heavier .243, and fired into the same spot. My hands trembled, my breaths ragged as I scanned the trail through the scope. The figure was gone. My phone buzzed in my pocket, jolting me out of my stupor. Dad was calling. His voice was frantic as he asked if I was okay. He and Grandpa had heard the scream from their blinds. I stumbled down the ladder, my legs shaking so badly I nearly fell. Dad met me halfway back to camp, his flashlight cutting through the pre-dawn gloom. "What happened?" he demanded. I tried to explain, my words tumbling over each other, but all I could manage was, "It saw me." Later, as the sun rose, we returned to the trail. There was no sign of the figure. No blood, no footprints. Nothing to prove I wasn't losing my mind. But I knew what I saw. The memory of its gaze, its scream, was etched into my bones. We still go back to Pine Hollow to hunt, but I never go alone anymore. And I never sit in the dark waiting. Whatever that thing was, it wasn't an animal. It wasn't human. And it's still out there somewhere watching. It was a crisp autumn evening, sometime in late October of 1993. I was 24, living in a quiet town nestled in the Appalachian foothills. The woods had always been my refuge, a place where I could lose myself and feel the weight of the world fade away. I wasn't the type to scare easily, especially not in the wilderness. If anything, the solitude comforted me. At the time, I worked as an electrician for the local power company. It was a small operation, which meant we had to juggle a lot of responsibilities: installations, repairs, even the unpleasant task of disconnecting delinquent accounts. But once the workday ended, I'd head straight into the woods, bow in hand, ready to unwind. Hunting wasn't just a hobby, it was my escape. I decided to explore a new stretch of land, about a mile off the main road. The area was known as Rushing Hollow, a patchwork of thick woods and abandoned farmland. Years ago, the place had been mined for coal, leaving behind rugged hills and valleys. The landowners rarely ventured out there, so it was ideal for hunting. I left work at 4, rushed home and changed into my camo gear. By 5, I was at the edge of the hollow, carrying my climbing stand, bow, and a small pack with a flashlight, a knife, and a water bottle. The sun was low in the sky, painting everything in shades of amber and crimson as I made my way along the overgrown trail leading to the ridge. The hike was tougher than I expected. Blackberry brambles snagged my pants, and the uneven ground forced me to slow down. But eventually, I found a spot to set up. A towering oak stood just beyond a clearing, its branches sprawling like an umbrella, perfect for a vantage point. I secured my stand, climbed about 20 feet up, and settled in. The woods were alive with the sounds of rustling leaves and distant bird calls. I nocked an arrow and waited, watching the shadows stretch and merge as the sun dipped below the horizon. A faint chill crept into the air. It was around 6:30 when I heard it, the soft crunch of footsteps. At first, I thought it might be a deer. The sound was subtle, deliberate, like something moving carefully through the underbrush. I squinted into the gloom, but the thicket made it impossible to see more than a few yards ahead. I stayed still, my breath shallow, waiting for the animal to reveal itself, but nothing came. By 7:30, the footsteps had stopped, and the forest fell into an eerie silence. The moon, nearly full, cast a pale glow over the landscape, and I decided it was time to pack up. Shooting hours were over, and I didn't want to navigate the woods too long after dark. Climbing down from the stand, I heard it again. A faint rustling, closer this time. My stomach tightened. I turned on my flashlight, the beam cutting through the shadows, but the dense undergrowth swallowed the light. I scanned the area, every nerve on edge, but saw nothing. I started back along the trail, keeping the moonlight to my left as a guide. The path was harder to find in the dark, and I ended up veering off into a patch of brambles. The thorns bit into my hands and legs as I pushed through, cursing under my breath. Finally, I stumbled into the open field, relieved to see the expanse of moonlit grass stretching before me. That's when I saw them. At first, I thought it was a shadow, a dark shape standing motionless on the trail about 50 yards ahead. But as I moved closer, the outline sharpened. It wasn't one shape, but two. Two figures, side by side, perfectly still. My heart pounded. They were standing exactly where I'd walked in earlier, blocking the only clear way out. I gripped my bow tighter, the weight of my quiver pressing against my back. "Hello?" I called out, my voice sounding more confident than I felt. No response. I kept walking, closing the distance. As I got closer, I could make out more details. A man and a woman, both young, maybe in their early 20s. They were dressed simply, the kind of clothes you'd wear on a chilly night. But something was off. Their faces were pale, their expressions blank, as if they weren't really seeing me. "It's pretty cold out here," I said, trying again. Still nothing, not a word, not a movement. I was only 10 yards away now. Every instinct screamed at me to turn and run, but the truck was on the other side of the creek, and they were standing between me and it. So I kept walking, brushing past them with a deliberate stride. They didn't react, didn't even turn their heads. I didn't stop until I reached the creek, the shallow water icy against my boots. I glanced back once, expecting to see them following, but they hadn't moved. They were still standing there, silhouetted against the moonlight, watching or not watching me leave. When I finally reached my truck, I hesitated. The woods were unnervingly quiet, and every shadow felt like a threat. I circled the vehicle, checking for anything unusual before getting in and locking the doors. The drive home was a blur, My mind raced with questions. Who were they? How had they gotten there without me noticing? And why hadn't they spoken or moved? The next morning, I discovered all 4 tires on my truck were punctured, filled with roofing nails. I spent half the day patching them up, trying to shake the unease that clung to me like a second skin. I never went back to Rushing Hollow alone, and even now, all these years later, I can't explain what happened that night. But sometimes, when the woods are quiet and the moon is full, I find myself thinking about those 2 figures, standing silently in the dark, and I wonder if they're still out there.